Welcome back. You're still watching World Inside with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live on CGTN Monday to Friday. All European Union leaders gather in Brussels on Thursday for a two-day summit. On top of the agenda are talks on who would likely succeed the EU's top jobs, the bloc's long-term budget, and action on climate change. European power centers Berlin and Paris are at odds, in fact, over who should succeed Jean-Claude Juncker as president of the EU executive, the European Commission. French President Emmanuel Macron is backing Michel Barnier, who is a former French foreign minister, while German Chancellor Angela Merkel supports Manfred Weber, a German politician. The goal is to have a candidate for parliamentary approval by July the 2nd. EU leaders are also set to work on a target of going carbon neutral by the year 2050. Meanwhile, Brexit campaigner Boris Johnson took a step closer to becoming Britain's next prime minister, winning 40% of votes in the second round of a contest on a firm promise to leave the European Union by October the 31st. So, what's likely to be the outcome of the EU summit? Let's hear it from our panelists in Paris. Jean-Claude Juncker, professor at the American Graduate School in Paris. In London, Matthew Bevington, a researcher on the UK in A Changing Europe. Last but not least, in our Beijing studio, Cui Hongjian, director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Mr. Juncker, professor, you are always not afraid to speak out. So, will the German and the French leaders agree on a consensus, do you think?
They will agree. Will they agree over the coming 36 hours? Not sure. But I don't think that should be that should wait in a very way on the way we think about this summit and we think about the agenda of the EU over the years coming up. I mean, that's in the tradition of the European Union. As a matter of fact, many observers describe the itinerary of the European Union as sort of a succession of major and minor and mid-sized crises. It's clear that there are so many difficulties right now. It's clear that what's happening on the other side of the British Channel with the October 31st deadline, as you mentioned, for British exit, if any. So the agenda is very, very challenging. Okay. Will Mr. Macron and Mrs. Merkel be tuned on the same vibrations right now? Eventually, yes. Not necessarily today or tomorrow.
I see. Mr. Bevington, this is a crucial time to let the European voices, whether you talk about one kind of European voices or the other kinds of European voices, but anyway, to let the European voices being heard in the world. We are experiencing some dramatic changes, but it has been muted so far. So, Mr. Bevington, do you think this time, this meeting, will in any way push the European voice louder on some of the crucial issues at all?
Well, I think there's so much on the agenda this time, it's unlikely that they're going to resolve all the issues. And I think, as the previous speaker was saying, it's probably unlikely that they're going to resolve the top jobs today. I think when it comes down to the EU, ultimately, it's always about balance.
Mr. Bevington, I'm not saying they're going to resolve anything. We all know it's a process. But during this process, whether the EU and important players within the EU will show their attitude, some kinds of consensus towards some of the most important issues going on in the world and in the region is important. The question really is, will they mute each other? Or will they, on some issues at least, be able to let their voice heard to a certain extent? That is the issue. That is making this meeting whether relevant or not. Mr. Bevington.
Well, I mean, the problem really is for the EU that there's really no consensus about the overall direction, I think, of the Union as a whole. You know, there's different incentives, whether it's in the north or the east or among sort of France and Spain, where there's a real desire to further integrate at rapid speed. There's a difference between the Eurozone members and the non-Eurozone members. There's a difference between the member states on defence, you know. So I think there's no sort of consensus on which to move forward on lots of issues. And really what it's about is muddling through from one issue to the next, finding one consensus after the next one. There's no real meaningful strategic thinking, I don't think, at this point, but it depends who gets the big jobs next.
Exactly.
You know, if it's someone like Michel Barnier, he could be the unifying force who actually, you know, has support from all 27 member states and can bring them together and sort of drive them along a particular path. But you know, that's a long way down. That's 2 or 3 steps ahead of us yet.
Right.
I wouldn't expect any change in the short term.
Mr. Cui, will they fight out a name first and then fight out the agenda and the consensus?
Yes, I think that it's not only just struggle for the name or who will be the top job, the successor. I think now it shows a lot of the, divergences among all of the, almost all of the issues. At this time, of course, the top job will be a priority for this summit, but we could also understand another, importance of another, issues, including the climate change and also reform of the Eurozone. Indeed, I think that now on one side that there will be more conflicts between member states and even between Parliament, European Parliament and the European Council on this process.
Right.
Which kind of process should it be? And secondly, I think now on our side that on some very special issue like climate change, certainly there will be a majority among member states. I think that's the whole picture now for European integration.
Mr. Professor Joab Toker, we see this meeting is taking place once again with the backdrop of the G20 summit take place in less than a week. Now, in the G20 summit, several European countries are going to be represented directly over there. For example, the UK, Germany, France, and some of the others. The European Union as well. So, will we see a possibility of those countries be able to speak in similar voices during the G20 on some of the crucial issues, whether it's about trade, global trade, whether it's about geopolitics, including the attitude toward the U.S.-China trade dispute, if not the bilateral potential, and also about the EU's role, Europe's role in the future of the world. Professor Toker, do you think that's likely to be a lineup leading up to the G20, or we're going to see more divisions really expressed during the G20 among these countries? Sir?
I don't know whether we're going to see more divisions in Osaka, Japan next week for the G20, but I think that we're going to see the level of divisions and nuances we have been accustomed to by the different countries of the European Union, including the representation of the EU itself as a member of the G20. So one should separate these things. The G20 is a forum which unites the most important voices on earth, but it is not as structured and is not as operational than the European Union. The European Union is a real institution with history, with agenda, with sort of a constitution, etc. So it's well more important that the level of divisions within the EU would be rather higher or rather lower,
right,
than whatever level of common speech they will exercise together or separately in Japan.
Okay. Mr. Babington, many of us still remember that photo during the G7 summit in which the German chancellor was trying to approach the American president while the other side was showing quite an attitude. I wouldn't use further adjectives. Meanwhile, you have the French president a bit showing concern, but a bit watching on as well. Now we have one player, the UK, lacking a prime minister already. So, in international occasions as crucial as this year's G20 summit, everybody believes it's going to be one of the most important events for this year. Is the European country, or rather, are the Europeans likely to show some kinds of concerted attitude or they're just going to be divided and conquered by whichever interest group that we're going to see prevail in the G20 summit?
Mm-hmm. Well, it always depends on the issue at hand, but I think one of the crucial things in the EU at the minute is that a lot of the key leaders are kind of they're on the way out in lots of ways. As you say, Theresa May is on the way out. Angela Merkel's coming to the end of her time. The Spanish Prime Minister is strong in the EU, but also weak at home. Macron is facing lots of divisions. So, there's no sort of real clear leader in the EU at the minute, and it seems to be in a kind of transition phase among the leadership at the minute. And I would expect it to take a few years really until this settles down again, and then a sort of clear view takes hold, because there's also the likes of Mark Rutte as well. A lot of the experience really is going by the wayside, and the likes of Tusk. Juncker will soon be replaced, as will the High Representative for Foreign Affairs. So there's a lot of movement is going to happen in the next year or two, and the EU and its institutions will look very different in that time.
Points taken, Mr. Cui. As a result of that, will the EU, whether it's called the EU or it's called the Europe, or the major voices coming from Europe, lose a historical opportunity to play a key role in how the world will be shaped up for the next few years to come?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think now perhaps the kind of trend for this situation. I think now maybe the biggest problem now for European Union is how could it find out a real, single voice or single stand. Even for this, just like we mentioned about the forthcoming G20 summit, this year is very different from previous.
Absolutely.
So far, it's so near, to this summit, but not yet. For all of the European countries, including European Union, had a kind of a common stand, which means that so far there are a lot of divergences among European countries. Another issue is, I think now, so far, not yet a common stand from the European Union, from European countries. How could Europe play which kind of role in the global governance, especially in the platform of the G20? Because of especially, for example, on the issue of how could the European Union to deal with the trade issue with the United States.
Right.
So far, Germany and France, they do have a lot of difference. So I think it gives a lot of troubles.
Certainly. Professor Tucker, one of the issues about Europe in recent years is how fluid the situation has been from one time toward another, how much differences existing and appear from time to time among these different countries. Do you think there is any kinds of sense of urgency among the top leaders of the European countries to be able to help them, or even force them, quote unquote, or force themselves to sit down and come up with something?
So it's a very interesting and deep question, because on one hand, what we see, and I think we can agree on that, is that practically all the leaders of the European nations do go through urgency when it comes to their national political landscapes. Some of these difficulties and tensions due on local grounds for many leaders in many countries in Europe are due to what is happening in the overall structure of the European Union for reasons related to Brexit or to economic issues or to ecological issues, etc., or to some kind of modalities which express themselves through positions regarding the European common policies. Is there a sense of urgency in the collective sense of the EU? Yes, but I would say that it is more a mechanical element, because elections to the European Parliament just took place a few weeks ago. Right. We know that there is a fragile situation in Germany. I'm not even finding an adjective to describe the situation in London or in Rome, for that matter, in Madrid to some extent. So there are signs of emergency and sirens of emergency all over the continent. Will that make the European Union more efficient in elaborating a common position? Not so sure.
Mr. Revington, now, pragmatically speaking, what can we expect really from this specific meeting? And among the candidates, what do they have in advantage that could be something that they could be proud of, and the country that are trying to push them to the most important chair can be used as evidence for support?
Well, the main candidate people talk about for the Commission is, as you mentioned, Manfred Weber. I mean, the EPP group, which is the centre-right group and which is backing him, is really been strongly behind him. But ultimately what they want is that their group has the position, not necessarily him. So I could see that he could fall by the wayside and perhaps end up as the President of the Parliament. I think Barnier is in a really good position because actually what he doesn't have that Weber does have is he's not very divisive actually. The Brexit process has really strengthened his hand. On the other hand, another really important issue for this round of appointments is gender, and there's quite a few leaders have really expressed the strength of feeling they have that the appointment should be gender balanced. And so Marguerite Vestager, who was the competition commissioner, seems to have a lot going for her, but the one thing she doesn't have is that she is not part of a Eurozone member state, so is not seen to be part of the core EU.
Yeah.
And then you have other figures as well, but I mean they're really the key ones people talk about when it comes to the Commission.
I see.
When it comes to the Council, it's a less contentious position. Usually it comes from the Council, and people talk about Dalia Grybauskaitė from Lithuania, who currently sits on the Council, as being the chair afterwards.
All right.
And then in the Parliament, it's a balancing act, but ultimately what will happen is each of the main groups will get a position of some kind, and then the question is who ends up with two rather than one, and who are the names. They're the big questions.
Of course, there are a lot of names, a lot of different political backgrounds. It really depends on how the internal fight will eventually come to a resolution. Before we go, final words from every one of you. What do you think this meeting, if we reflect upon it in the near future, could serve its role for the EU? Mr. Babington, you go first. One sentence if you can.
I think it will show really what's been hidden during the Brexit process, which is there are a lot of divisions within the EU, and really this is how the EU normally works, and that Brexit has been a bit of a step away from that, really.
I see. Professor Toker.
And I would add to what my distinguished colleague in London said, that it's not only a British problem in and of all, but it's sort of taking hostage many of the normal activities of the EU because of the Brexit. But I would recommend to pay attention to those elements which are not right now on the top agenda, about which the summit today and tomorrow can make some progress. One of them, ecology and climate change, and the second, very important,
we are running out of time.
The US-Iranian crisis.
Okay, Mr. Cui, final words.
Yes, now I think a really question for European Union is not any challenge from outside, from inside towards integration, except for the Brexit.
Okay.
The real problem is now every country is struggling for the definition of which kind of integration. So this meeting will give the answer.
Cui Hongjian, Matthew Levington, Joab Toker, thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining us. Thank you, really appreciate it.